This might be a quick video. You could entitle The Metaphysics of the Street Protest. And there's a basic mantra, there's a basic aphorism, there's a basic catchphrase that essentially goes along the lines of, we need to go into the real world. This is something that you heard a lot in 2016, you heard in 2017, you even heard in 2018. We need to go into the real world. We can't be an online movement. Which is just crazy to me from a historical perspective. It would be like Charles Darwin saying, it's not enough to write a book. I need to stand on the street corner and scream to passerbys and hold up placards saying evolution is real. Or it would be like the scholastic monks of the 12th century saying, no, we can't just send letters to one another. We can't just write books. We have to stand, we have to hire a town crier to hold up a placard and to hold up pictures that explain our ideas to the public. Or it would be like Marx, saying that, although Marx is a little bit of a more populist figure, but it would be like Marx saying, there's nothing, if we just stay confined to the written word, if I just write my Communist Manifesto, I will leave no impact in the world. Really, the important thing to do is to go out in the streets, get in the barricades. Marx was an intellectual. So there have been so many intellectuals throughout history who have been significant. People who never did any kind of street action, any kind of street protest. I'm going to give you a hypothetical example. You have two choices. On the one hand, you can organize a march and you can organize a protest and you can, through some magical spell, you can impel 100,000 people to descend on any given American city. You can take let's make it 1 million. No, let's make it 100 million. 100 million people you can get to mobilize in Washington, D.C. You have that power. Or your alternative is that you change the mind of one person, that you seize the mind of one person, and you're able to convince them of anything that you want. What do you choose? But before you make your choice, there's something key, there's something critical. You might be considering, you might be mulling it over. You say, well, if I could change Donald Trump's mind, or I could change George Soros' mind, how powerful would that be? But, 100 million people, that's pretty powerful, right? But you haven't asked a question, because I've left out information here. The question is, toward what purpose are you mobilizing the 100 million? All I said is, you can get 100 million people in the street. I didn't tell you that it was for a feminist march. I didn't tell you that it was for a march against abortion. I didn't tell you anything about the content of the march. I simply said you can get 100 million people in the streets. 100 million people in the streets. We understand through this example that mythology is primary, that the mind comes before the matter. There are marches that go on basically every day in America. Protest marches go on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis. And you have a women's march and millions of people go and march in the streets. But it's for the wrong cause. If I told you you can get 1 million feminists out in the streets, or you could change one person's mind, you would obviously choose the latter because the former is harmful. So what matters is not people in the streets. What matters primarily is the ideology, the mythology, the beliefs, the axioms, the telos that is being promoted. All of those concepts are intellectual in nature. They're in the mind. They're contained within the mind. They're developed within the mind. We argue about them. We decide whether we believe them or not within the inner workings of our mind. Now, people can say that, Osama bin Laden said that the stronger horse wins, and so, logic is nothing, and rhetoric is everything, and how you present yourself is everything. And look what ISIS was able to achieve, and look at this and look at that. The problem with that is that's a lie told to you by the CIA and the FBI. Okay? American intelligence created ISIS. Israeli intelligence created ISIS. It was thought up in the minds of elites. ISIS was not an organic mass protest movement. ISIS was not, it didn't just come along and say, oh, well, we're so cool. We have millions of dollars in media and graphic design and video production. And so people just organically started joining ISIS. No, it was planned and it was implemented. And what was necessary for ISIS to ever come into creation was the planning part. Al-Qaeda is a very similar story. Al-Qaeda was developed by Brzezinski. Brzezinski, and his book you should go read, is The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives. Zbigniew Brzezinski. He planned Al-Qaeda. I mean, he created the Taliban. He worked with Osama bin Laden. So, the intelligence is required before the action. If you don't have intelligence, your action is meaningless. And so people who say, well, we have some great intelligence here, we have some great ideas, now it's time to bring it into the real world. Now it's time to do some real world action, some meat space, because the internet is great, but the internet is ghettoizing, and the internet's not enough, and you need more than the internet. Now, this might be true on an emotional level in terms of sociability. I would make the argument that being face-to-face with someone is so much more powerful than being over a Skype call or being over the internet, a YouTube video. Being in the same room with someone is much more powerful than just watching a video. So that's true in a sense. But when we talk about a street protest or a street march, really, most of the effect of these street protests and marches on the wider society are transmitted through media, are transmitted through video. The impact of, say, Charlottesville or the Women's March, any kind of mass demonstration, in the present day, the effect is not in the immediacy of the event itself, but it's in the aftermath, it's in the media portrayal, it's in how it gets out there. So, again, we come to the conclusion that the mind and the interpretation and the presentation of real-world events actually precedes the events themselves, and it comes afterward. So there's a sort of a sandwich effect where the event itself only exists in the minds of the people insofar as it was first planned intelligently, and secondarily that it was presented intelligently. You can take an event, and lawyers do this all the time, right? Lawyers can take an event, and they can swing it one way or the other. They can make it look like a person's guilty or not guilty and fool a jury. Right? So it's not the event itself that matters, but the perception of the event. And people who are actually smart, people who are actually rich, they don't invest their money in real-life action per se. They invest their money in perception. Perception is everything. If you can make people believe that you're powerful, that belief is more powerful than your real power. So, if I have no firearms. If I had, 100 guns, then theoretically I'd have a lot of firepower, right? But my influence on the wider society is nothing because those guns mean nothing. I mean, you look at what happened in Las Vegas. There was a man, and we don't know much about him because it's all secret, it's all hidden. But there was a man, and he went up into a hotel in Las Vegas, and he started shooting people. Why did he do that? We don't know. And that shooting has had very little societal impact. It was a mass shooting. It was a huge shooting. Very little impact because the motives are unclear. The reasons are unclear. The beliefs, the axioms, the telos behind it is unclear. Now, of course, there is something. It could be mental disease. It could be a brain tumor. It could be a number of things. We don't know. It's been hidden from us. It's been swept under the carpet. But that has not had a big societal impact versus something like Dylann Roof. Dylann Roof killed a far smaller number of people, but his telos was clear. And so that event had a much bigger effect on the wider society. Jussie Smollett and his hoax, who did he harm? What did he affect? I mean, all he did was rough himself up. He got a little cut on his cheek. The physical impact of the event itself is not so significant. It's the way that he tried to present it And now the truth is being unveiled and presented to people. So again, the presentation is all that matters. If a protest happens in a forest and nobody's around to perceive it, does it matter? No. All that matters is our perception in this sense. All that matters is the way that we perceive the qualitative and the quantitative perception of events. The internet is essentially pure perception. Now, we could talk about events that happen on the internet. Oh, this person made a comment, this person made a video. But we could distinguish, we could buy into this distinction, right? People say that, oh, no, the internet's useless, or it's limited, or it's ghettoizing. They'll criticize internet activity, and they'll say, at some point, we need to get out into the real world. At some point, we're going to hit a threshold where we need to get out in the real world. And I'll say that's valid when people are physically starving. If people are not physically starving, that's not valid. There are very few violent revolutions that have ever happened where the people were not under some kind of physical duress, some kind of physical deprivation. Very few cases. Very few cases. And you look at, it seems that humanity as a whole, especially Europeans, are being more and more pacified psychologically to the point where they're willing to tolerate anything. We, as Europeans, we would not have tolerated 100 years ago the things that we now tolerate today. And that's because we've chemically changed, we've genetically changed, because of plastics in the environment, because of other harmful chemicals and toxins, because testosterone levels have chemically dropped by half. So psychologically, chemically, we've changed. Genetically, we've changed. Mutations and dysgenics has changed the average genetic profile of a European person from 100 years ago. Morphologically, we've changed. The skull has changed. And Franz Boas actually looked at this and he said, and people today like to laugh at Franz Boas and call him a hoaxer. And obviously his telos, I disagree with where he was coming from ideologically. But the interesting thing is actually the skull shape does change in response to environment. And you can look back in your own ancestry and you look at your ancestors who underwent hard times, they're much shorter than you. Because the body responds morphologically. We can look at the jaw and all these modern teeth problems that we have. It's because our jaw is underdeveloped, because we don't have as much testosterone. So there are changes in the environment that lead to changes morphologically and psychologically, because the brain is a physical organ. So anytime you have some kind of morphological change as a result of genetic change, it seems likely, or it seems credible, that if the brain is a physical organ, and we know that if we physically manipulate the brain, we can change your psychology, then if you see someone with a larger or a smaller jaw, that's going to correlate with the psychological change. So, European peoples have changed significantly in what they're willing to tolerate. And you look at the whites of South Africa, and they are willing to tolerate a 180-degree change from apartheid to the present day. They're tolerating it. They are tolerating it. There is no violent revolution. There's no violent revolution. So to say that, that we're going to hit some point where a violent revolution is possible, I would say, okay, maybe if people are starving. If you get a critical mass of starving people, then I could see a violent revolution being a credible prediction. Otherwise, I look at European peoples and they seem to be willing to endure any kind of humiliation. They seem to have no honor whatsoever in terms of who they'll let into the country or the actions they'll allow to be inflicted upon them psychologically, physically, anything. It's a masochistic mentality, and that's why I say no matter how many street marches you do, no matter how much flyering you do, no matter how much you do in the real world, no matter how many guns you have, it will never change anything if you don't change the mentality of people. That's primary. And we would have to evaluate real-world actions with respect to how effective are they at actually changing minds. And the truth is they're not very effective at all. And if we look at the, the opportunity cost, this is an economic term, which you might be familiar with. The economic, the opportunity cost refers to the loss incurred when producing or undergoing activity which is less than optimal. So, you know, if I told you, hey, you can use this pencil sharpener to sharpen your pencil in about 20 seconds, or you can use your teeth and your nails to manually sharpen the pencil, but it's going to take you like 5 minutes to properly sharpen the pencil. You're going to break it a couple times. If I give you those two options and you choose the latter and you choose to use your nails and your teeth, you're incurring an opportunity cost. Similarly, when you spend your time buying guns and organizing in the streets and doing street protests and street marches, you could have been making a YouTube video or something similar. I'm not saying you have to operate on YouTube, but utilize the internet and the power that it's giving you, analogous to the printing press. I mean, Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation was a heretical movement against the Catholic Church. There had been other heretical movements. I believe it's Henry IV of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, tried to usurp the power of the Pope and say, no, I have the right to appoint bishops within Germany, and then there was the investiture contest. That was 500 years prior to Protestantism, and there were other different forms of heresy, and you can look at all the little different heretics that existed in Europe, and they were all put down. But then Martin Luther had access to the printing press, and that had allowed his ideas to spread faster than the Catholic Church could clamp down on those ideas. So you have to see the internet as the only chance here. The internet's the only chance. If you're doing anything other than being on the internet, you're wasting your time. It's a disgusting waste of time. Now again, I'm not saying that if you're lonely and you have no friends, that you shouldn't meet up with people. You know, people can meet and people can have camaraderie, and, you know, I think there's something significant to just giving someone a hug and having, we lack, I think, a lot, especially Northern Europeans are sort of biased toward this, but there is a lack of physical intimacy. Because physical intimacy, there is a hermeneutics of sexuality where we have come to the point, we've come so far, you know, in the Victorian era, men could hold hands. That wasn't a sexual thing. Now everything has been so homosexualized that anytime men have physical intimacy in terms of hugs or whatever, any kind of physical contact is always regarded as homosexual, which is a tragedy because as human beings, male and female, we need comradeship or we need to have companionship and intimacy, not just in a sexual sense. Sexuality is really, it's really intense. And, you know, if you just are sexual, if all of your intimacy comes from sex, that can be very destructive. You need non-sexual or platonic intimacy with other people. Just, you know, shaking hands or being in the same room as someone else. So if you're not getting that, I'm not saying don't have friends in the real world. I'm not saying become a brain in a jar, because people have needs that are ancestral. We develop socially, and our social instincts are derived from our ancestral environment where all we did all day was spend time with other people. The concept of alone time is a very foreign concept to Paleolithic peoples and to Neolithic peoples as well. And P.D. Problo has brought to my attention Lewis Mumford, who is very interesting, and he has three terms, the Eotechnic, the Paleotechnic, and the Neotechnic. And the Eotechnic is essentially medieval Europe. The Paleotechnic is the early Industrial Revolution. The Neotechnic is the present age. And those three stages are interesting. But through all of these stages, up until the present day, the level of social isolation that we have really would be considered hermitage, or that you're a hermit if you can spend the entire day and not talk to anyone, not see anyone. So that is a clear problem. I'm not denying that's a problem in terms of our social psychological health. Of course, that's something that most people need to work on. Most people have a huge problem with loneliness. Even if you're surrounded by, you live in New York City, for instance, you pass by people every day, and you can still be intensely lonely. So that loneliness is a huge problem and a huge factor in the rate, the white suicide rate that's increasing day by day. So I'm not telling people not to have friends and not to be platonically intimate and not to meet with people in the real world. But as far as politics and metapolitics and culture and religion and all of these questions, which are fundamentally mental questions, ideological questions, we're looking at a second printing press. We're looking at the internet. If you're not using it, if you're doing something else, there's an opportunity cost. There's a risk to going out in the real world. You're activating the immune system of the thing you're trying to fight against, of the system, of the state, of, you know, the right-wingers, of Antifa, the people who want to preserve the status quo, who want to preserve the current mythology. You're activating their immune system. Whereas doing something online, whether that's video production or a blog or a podcast, or you're writing or you're producing artwork and putting it up on the internet, so much more powerful qualitatively and quantitatively, because it has a permanent presence, and because and people could argue and say that, well, you know, we're only doing this street protest so that we can upload it to YouTube. And that's really the intention of the street protest. But you look at the cost of these street protests, and they're very high. And from my opinion is that they only seem to engender more street protests. Someone looks at a street protest and it looks effective, and they say, oh, well, let's just keep doing this over and over again. That's going to burn you out, you know, in all sorts of ways. That the punishments of the state and the corporate industrial complex, they're going to come down hard on you. You're going to lose everything. And if you're someone with nothing to lose, you're someone with nothing to offer. Okay, that's something that people really don't understand. And so, again, I have to counter-signal against this. I have to disavow the idea of doing things in the real world. And that is such a maligned concept. And it's stupidly maligned. It's stupid. I mean, and that's the nature of the subject matter, right? People who have a brain are smart enough to realize that brain power is more important than bodies in the streets. But dumb people are not smart enough to realize that. And so my arguments will never convince them, because they just get this emotional, hedonistic, fetishistic rush when they're out in the streets and they're fighting Antifa. And you know, this is really bad. You have an addiction. You have an addiction to edgy politics as a form of pornography. You get a rush from breaking the taboo. And it's really no different from any other fetishist. And it's destructive and it's self-serving. You're not changing the world. You're not making the world a better place. It's very solipsistic and it's sad. And you should stop. And it's very frustrating. And, you know, I would like to convince people. Optimally, I'd like to convince people. And so I am wary of the fact that my passion can be offensive and that people might turn away. But at the end of the day, I do understand I don't have the magical power to convince anybody. That would be a wonderful power to have. I don't have it. And so I understand I'm going to be able to engage with people on the other side or argue against this street protest mantra, getting in the meat space, getting in the real world. I'm going to argue against that. I'm not going to convince the people who are engaged with it. They're stuck in their ways. They're never going to admit that they were wrong. They're never going to apologize. But that doesn't matter. That's not my goal. My goal is to convince the third party, the audience, who looks at this back and forth and says, you know, these street people have been marching in the streets since the 1930s in America. We know about the Silver Shirts. We know about the German-American Bund. We know about all of these organizations that were marching in the streets. And you know who was the most dangerous man in the 1930s was not the people marching in the streets. It was Father Coughlin, because he utilized the radio effectively. And they had to shut him down illegally against the First Amendment. They did it totally illegally. And he had the right strategy. He was doing the right thing. And because he was so good at what he did, they had to shut him down. But you had other people who were marching in the streets, and they picked that tradition right up back in the 1950s with the neo-Nazis, with George Lincoln Rockwell, who were supposed to worship these people. And again, this continues, and just it doesn't cease. It doesn't stop. And then you have Tom Metzger, and Tom Metzger was a brilliant guy, and he got elected to Congress, and he would do these street marches, and he said, this isn't working, so I must be doing something wrong. I just need to be more hardcore. I need to be smarter. I need to be more vicious. I need to be more intelligent about this. And he kept pushing it, and he pushed it to a limit where he said, this isn't the fault of me. It's not my fault. It's not that I'm just not good enough at this thing. It's that this isn't working. This isn't a right strategy. This isn't proper. And he admitted that. And that took a lot of, I mean, anytime someone's wrong, and anytime someone invests their essentially entire adult life, or the apex of their career, so to speak, their activity in life, and they invest that, and it turns out to be the wrong strategy, to come out and admit that was wrong to do, like fundamentally, metaphysically wrong, that's difficult. And I see so much, more remorse and more understanding and more just admitting of the facts of the situation from people who were active in the 1980s than these people who just have no institutional memory. They haven't looked at history. They don't care about history because they're egotistical. They want their face on the camera. They want to look badass. They don't want a police escort because, again, when we look at Unite the Right 1 versus Unite the Right 2, Unite the Right 1's a disaster, huge legal costs, millions of dollars, people in jail, lives ruined, jobs lost, families broken up, people committing suicide. Unite the Right 2, Jason Kessler is surrounded by a police escort, and he has like 9 non-whites with him or something like that. He's got like a black, he's got a mestizo, he's got everybody. And that, much more successful than Unite the Right 1. And it was because it was about ideas. It wasn't about just getting the most number of people. And so there was this sacrifice made where you saw unlikely alliances of people who really had nothing in common. You had skinheads fighting side by side with people in white polos. And it's like, whoa, 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 why are you what is this all about? I said, we're uniting the right. We're putting aside our differences, and we're uniting for a common cause because we're going to reach a critical threshold where we're going to like break through the conditioning. And, that's the exact opposite of what your mentality should be. Your mentality should be, let's be diverse. Let's specialize. Let's all hone our narratives. Because there's some real interesting narratives out there that should be explored. The concept that the United States is fundamentally evil because it was founded by Freemasons, I encourage people to explore that idea. Because I think at the end of the day, you're going to come up against the fact that, actually Freemasonry in its telos, there's a legitimacy to egalitarianism. And just being that Hobbesian right-wing despot is not actually a very moral political system. Meritocracy, egalitarianism, these are actually important values that allowed the Indo-Europeans to spread across from Ireland to India in the first place because they had a meritocratic, egalitarian, similar to other Northern Europeans. They had an ethos which was not right-wing. It was anti-despotic. Every Indo-European mythos is about killing the giants, killing the despot, killing the tyrant, and instituting egalitarian meritocracy, where it's not the man. And you look at the Viking myth of the Volsung family. And the Volsung family, they're not the most noble of the Norsemen. They're not the aristocratic class. There are other people who are kings above them and princes and lords who have a better claim to the throne, so to speak. But they have a special blood. The whole tale is a meritocracy. It's all about overthrowing the old order, the old decaying aristocracy, the old decaying, people who have titles because of their ancestors, and replacing them with people who actually have real power, who actually have real merit. And how do we define merit? That's an important question. That's something we should discuss. So we need to understand history. We need to understand what is our ethical system? What is our moral system? What is our teleology? What are we going for here? This is not clear. This is not clear. Everything in a street march is always reactionary. It's always like, we don't like this, we don't like that. We're fighting against this, we're fighting that. It's negative. It's not creative. It's not constructive. Constructive vertical thinking happens in the realm of ideas. That's something that can happen beautifully on the internet. Not something that happens so beautifully in real life. I don't know how long I can rant on this. This is, I just don't understand the whole concept. And I guess I'll read this by Charles Linder. He says, The militia point should have been explained in detail. What if the militia were modeled in a way that allows your priestly-minded people to control the practices of the warrior class? Well, here's my message to the warrior class. Don't go in the street. Go to MMA, go to jiu-jitsu, go to boxing, and get out your physical aggression. Go to the gym. Do that. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. Don't march in the street. So if I was to tell or advise, I was to say, hey, the priest class needs to tell this to the warrior class, that would be my advice. Not to form a militia. There's no purpose to a militia. No amount of guns is going to solve the problem. Because what matters at the end of the day is not the gun itself. What matters is the mind of the person holding the gun. And if their mind is toward a good teleology, for instance, a police officer who's trying to shoot a school shooter, that police officer has a good telos. But if we're talking about a gang member in Chicago who wants to kill some innocent people, then that's a bad telos. So again, what matters not is the gun, what matters is the mind behind the gun. Guns can be used for good, they can be used for evil. A militia can be organized quickly. If a collapse came, if people were starving in the streets, I would say, okay, militia is a legitimate idea. We're not there. There's so much intellectual work that has to be done because people don't understand these very basic things. People who, can compose sentences and look reasonably intelligent, they don't understand these things. So obviously, it's not a time for a militia. If people don't have basic understanding of basic concepts, it's not the time for a militia. And this should be a fundamental principle, a fundamental axiom that you have mind before matter. That martial activity should only be in response to martial threats. The threats are humiliation. The threats are psychological. The threats are people are making fun of whiteness, and people are degrading whiteness, and people are calling whiteness the most evil thing on the planet. It's not that they're using physical action against you. Okay, I have never been the victim of a hate crime. I have never been the victim of a physical crime. I have been the victim of, psychological bullying, of hateful rhetoric. So that is the plane of battle here. If you respond to words with guns, you're going to lose. Because the state and the military and the police has way more guns than you, you're going to lose. But if you respond to words and to a battle of minds and mythology with a better mythology, with a stronger mythology, and you come at it with more truth and more ferocity in the plane of ideas, that is something you could theoretically win, but you can't win the other one. This organization, I'm going to continue reading the comment. The organization could in turn teach strategic importance of being patient, gentlemanly, and compassionate toward your target audience. Without a way of controlling might, we will never attain right. It's not true. Might follows right. If you have the right idea at the right time, you can't kill an idea with an army. If you have the right idea at the right time, the might will materialize, the might will manifest, the mind will manifest in reality what it wants to. But if you have a bunch of guns, if you have a bunch of might, and you have no right, you're just, again, like the Las Vegas strip shooter, he's just killing people randomly, he has no right to do so, and so all his might means nothing. He's irrelevant now, no one cares. Now there might be a backstory there that's interesting, but this is the fact that you need right before you have might. Might means nothing without right. So Ragnar Redbeard is stupid, and social Darwinism is stupid, and I totally reject it, and I totally disavow it. If you want to teach people how to be patient and gentlemanly and compassionate, you can do that through a number of mental means. I would say religion would be a great one, any kind of spiritual practice. But, even a university and academic context, there's so many ways to do that. By having a social group, by having some form of club or something. It doesn't have to be a militia. Why does it have to be a militia? Where is this idea of having a militia, of attacking the enemy at their strongest point? Okay, so let's go down. I respond to him and he responds back to me. And he says he's not married to having a militia. Great, I appreciate you saying that. If not a militia, there needs to be some type of mechanism that prevents another Charlottesville. Those that understand public relations need to guide the enthusiasm of the warrior class through some type of means. Without solid public relations, Skinheads will continuously obliterate quality progress by handing negative press to the right on a platter. Well, I'm not part of the right wing, so I don't need to be... There's no connection between me and skinheads necessarily. I say the best way to not have another Charlottesville is to tell people, don't do a Charlottesville. Don't do a street protest. Don't join a militia. And call these people, insult them, and bully them, and shame them. That's the best way to achieve that, in my opinion. These people did that. They went there because they were encouraged by really stupid people who said, oh, we're going to go to Charlottesville. It's going to be awesome. And they created this perception that this was the way to affect real change. When, again, it would be like, instead of Martin Luther writing his 95 Theses, if instead he just started, you know, sucker punching priests. If he went around with physical violence in a militia, he would have failed. But because he went around with ideas, he succeeded. Now, the might followed. The princes then followed and backed him up with arms. And then you had the 30 Years' War and so on. So the might came after the right. But the physical manifestation always follows the ideas. You know, what do we have in terms of skinheads? The National Socialist movement was just taken over by a black man. So, you know, there are always going to be pornographic, hedonistic, fetishistic people who are going to attach themselves to any kind of edgy movement because they think it's cool. Not because they're moral people, not because they want to better themselves, not because they want to better the world, but because, you know, they heard that Hitler was bad and therefore they hate themselves and they want to be evil. They want to be sadistic because they have all this internal negative energy, and so they say, you know, I'm a misanthrope and so I'm going to be a Nazi. That's their reason for being a skinhead. And so, you know, that's a natural consequence of the fact that there's a dominant mythology that says that, you know, being a skinhead is evil. And so then these people become skinheads because they want to be evil. And I can't prevent that other than by changing the mythological perception of history and politics and race. That's not something I'm going to do by trying to meet these people halfway and say, oh, well, you know, you're a skinhead, but there's something better you could be doing here. No, once you've gone skinhead, as far as I'm concerned, you're a lost sheep. And, you know, I wipe my feet of dust upon you, and I don't want anything to do with you. And if some of those people realize the error of their ways and they beg for forgiveness, I can be a forgiving person. I can, you know, say, well, you know, it was courageous of you to realize the error of your ways. But I'm not going to waste my time trying to fix broken people. It's always easier to mold a new pot than to fix a broken one. If I give you a glass vase and I shatter it, it's going to take you much more time to put the pieces back together than just make a new glass vase. And that's the way people work psychologically. When we look at people who are skinheads, when we look at people who are defective and who want to look badass, they want to look evil, they want to look edgy, and they go out in the streets, I'm not going to waste my time trying to control those people because that would be like herding cats. What I'm going to try to do is take young people, impressionable people, people who might go that way, and I'm going to tell you, that's stupid. Don't go that way. Don't be like those people. Be smart. Use your brains, because the people who rule us use their brains. George Soros didn't get where he got by having street brawls. George Soros got where he got by using his brains. So all these people have used their brains to achieve their objectives. And if you can do the same thing, then you have a chance of competing with them. But if you're not open to that, and you just say, no, we just have to do real-world action. You know, Martin Luther shouldn't have posted the 95 Theses. He should have got out and done a street protest. That kind of stuff is just so historically wrong. It just doesn't match up with how humans work in terms of their mass psychology, in terms of sociology, and in terms of metaphysics. The fact that we say, you know, God spoke the world into creation. The first thing alongside him was the Logos. The Logos was with God. That's the Word. So that is primary. And if we have mythological dominance, then we control the state. That's the way mythology works. And Ryan Falk did a great... Now, Ryan Falk is an anti-religious person. But Ryan Falk did a great series back when he was an anarcho-capitalist. He was an anti-statist. He did a great series saying that the state is nothing. The state is nothing. The state could collapse tomorrow. The only thing that holds the state in place is the mythology of the state. Now, I'm not an anti-statist. I don't reject the state. I say that instead of, pointing out that the state has nothing to it, the state is a paper tiger, and therefore we should overthrow the state and live in a stateless society, I say no. We should control the mythology that gives credence to the state. We should be the dominant mythology, and then we'll control the state. You don't overthrow the state with guns. You overthrow the state mythologically. Now, there are certainly cases in history where a stronger empire defeats a smaller state. We're not a stronger empire. We're not going to defeat a smaller state because we have no state. A stateless people cannot defeat another state through, the realm of military and statism. The Germanic peoples conquered Rome because they had a better military, because they actually infiltrated the Roman military. So again, we could go case by case, and I'd love to see someone try to historically debunk what I'm saying and say, oh, well, here's a case where there was a violent revolution and people weren't starving in the streets, and, all the factors I've mentioned. So, they weren't starving in the streets, and they were militarily inferior, and, oh, well, look at Vietnam. Well, Vietnam, the communists, Vietnamese, they were nationalists, they were communists. All that ideology held the Viet Cong together. In every case, every war in history, you want to tell me how it was determined? Oh, well, it's not just all about morality and ideology in the mind. There's a strategic element as well. Well, where does strategy come from? The mind. Again, if we were in a shooting war, if Antifa was getting out in the streets with machine guns and going up to local Republican buildings and just shooting people, they aren't committing a degree of violence, but they're backed by the CIA, they're backed by the FBI. Are you willing to challenge the CIA on the FBI on their terms with physical violence? I hope not. I hope you don't go down that route, because that's supremely stupid. You should never, Sun Tzu says, you should never attack your enemy at his strongest point. You should attack him at his weakest point. The state is very mythologically fragile. It's very mythologically weak. The principles that it espouses, it's Orwellian. It's 1984. They're taking things that are patently false, and they're promoting them as the truth. And so that is the weakness that you should attack, not the military, not going in the streets, because that's where the state has supremacy. That's the strongest point of the state. So I think I've made the point emphatically enough. I've made it long enough. It's 42 minutes of me just talking about one topic over and over again, saying it repeatedly, with emphasis and repetition. And I hope it sticks in people's brains. And I don't know how many times I'm going to have to make this same exact point, this same exact video over and over again. But I will, continue to make it, because it needs to be made, because people don't come to a YouTube channel and watch all the videos. They come to one video, and then they ask a question, or they propose an idea that's been debunked several videos back. That's just the nature of people, and I can't blame people for being as they are. I can only address them as they are, and try to come up with a solution. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye-bye.